We're going to continue our series of Episcopal 101. Last week we had a handout where we basically went through the Holy Communion service, and we sort of laid out the particulars of the worshiping life of what we do and why we do it in the church. This week I want to go into the theological or the doctrinal life. Why do we believe? Why do we do what we do based on belief? And basically set this against other denominations and groups of Christians to sort of explain what's the difference between the Catholic worldview and the Episcopal worldview, and say the Methodist religion. Yes?
Forgive me if I interrupt you.
Sure, go ahead.
I heard that this is Pastor's Appreciation Month, and then somebody told me you've been here for 5 years.
Yes, I have.
So, we got together, and we want to offer you this gift.
Oh, I thank you very much.
And I have to tell you that it was embroidered by Gail. And what's left here, Pastor,
Oh, how nice.
and this is for you to use for whatever you want.
Thank you very much. Fantastic, how lovely.
I secretly gave them your
Yeah.
That goes to your wife.
We appreciate you too.
Would you be able to wear it for our church service today?
Well, I'm already sweating.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's washable, by the way.
Yeah.
We don't like it.
Oh, good. Now I'm going to start. What's the difference between the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church? Because that's really the focus of many of the questions. I know Bobby, he gave me some questions that basically focused on that. Bobby comes from a Catholic background, as do many other people in our congregation. Mary Guarneri, our senior warden, was raised as a Roman Catholic, for example. And I know Dick still is a Roman Catholic of some sort. You know, if you stare at Dick during Holy Communion, he doesn't put his hands up. He opens his mouth and sticks his tongue out at it. Now, is he being rude? Well, usually, yes. But the Catholic, the old Catholic practice, before Vatican II in the 1970s, what he was trained as a child, was that you open your mouth and the priest placed the host in your tongue. That's the old Catholic practice. The modern one is to receive it in the hands, the Protestant one. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is, I'll say this up front, the Catholic Church for about 100-odd years has used the Episcopal Church as its canary in the coal mine. What do I mean by that?
I don't know.
Changes that the Episcopal Church has made in its life usually are followed by the Catholic Church within 25, 50, 75 years. Many of the and the reason why is that no longer are people or churches in isolation. When we have these meetings of bishops, that the influence of Catholic theologians is just as strong as Anglican theologians. This on Friday, the Synod of the Amazon was concluded in Rome. That was a major gathering of the bishops from the Amazon region. And they came up with a very large statement. 2/3 of it's about the environment. But then they also had some statements about the life of the church. The first is that they're asking the Pope to look into women deacons. Now, in the Episcopal Church, we had, beginning in the 19th century, deaconesses. Deaconesses were not deacons. Deaconesses were women who were not ordained, but they were sort of like what I would call secular nuns. They had specific jobs and ministries, but they didn't live in the community or take vows of that nature. In the 1970s, the Episcopal Church began to take deaconesses and make them deacons. And then within 5 years, they've made women priests. The Synod, the Amazon Synod has asked the Pope to have women deacons. Now, here's the thing. If you accept the premise of women deacons, there is no theological or logical argument to say you can't have women priests or women bishops. So the opening the door to women deacons, which Francis has basically said he's going to do, means that probably within some of our lifetime. Well, where's Bella? If Bella were here, I would say within Bella's lifetime, you'll have female Roman Catholic priests.
Interesting.
The Catholic Church, the other things that the German Church has been pushing is to allow former Roman Catholics who've been divorced and remarried to worship in the Episcopal Church and get married a second time in the church. Now, who's been doing that since the 40s? The Episcopal Church. The other thing that Pope Francis wants to change is the issue of birth control. Birth control, in 1930, the Anglican world said birth control can be a moral thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not evil. It's not the same thing as abortion. The Catholic Church in 1972, I think it was, reiterated its traditional viewpoint that birth control is a bad thing. But many of the arguments that were used to support changing it were from the Anglican world, with Catholics having sort of helped form that argument. The current Pope is in favor of changing that. So when I say canary in the coal mine, the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church are in essence on the same trajectories, except one is about 100 years ahead. And it doesn't mean the Episcopal Church is doing a better job. We're just the ones making all the mistakes so that other people can learn not how to do it. Yes.
The Amazon bishops are also asking that they be allowed to marry.
Yes. The other bit, and I think that's the thing that we'll see first. Married Catholic priests.
But I think
Now,
that's good.
yes,
Has the Episcopal
I really do.
priests always been allowed to marry?
yes,
Always.
always.
So that wouldn't have changed.
That was one of the first immediate, Queen Elizabeth, the first, said one of the things that she never quite got used to was a bishop's wife. Because, you know, hers was the first generation of married bishops, and it sort of gave her the creeps that, you know, these men would bring people with them to dinner. But, I mean, that was a major change. Married priests. Now, why does the Catholic, now, there are married Catholic priests, essentially two types, what are called Eastern Rite. Eastern Rite are Ruthenian or Greek Catholic, Ukraine, Eastern, you know, Czechoslovakia, that parts of the world. Now that came from, those were up to the 14th, 15th century, they were Orthodox, and the Orthodox have always allowed priests to marry. Bishops had to be celibate, so bishops always came from monks or unmarried priests. But parish priests were always married. And in fact, it was considered a bad thing not to be married if you were a parish priest, because your wife, in essence, was the assistant priest, but running the social side of the parish. And that's true today in, if you go to a Greek Orthodox parish or something, I mean, the wife really has a major role that is completely different from the idea of the principal priest's wife role. Usually they're alcoholics that you don't bring to church. Now, in the 10th century, the Catholic Church stopped having married priests. And they did it for financial reasons. Because they had the problem of when the priest died, his family claimed the property of the church, the rectory, the land around which the church was that provided income from farming. And it was found to be a lot cheaper and more efficient to forbid priests to marry, to keep everything in the family, in the household. The Catholic Church has basically approved at the Synod, which, just because the Synod approves it doesn't mean doesn't mean it's going to happen. The Pope has to decide. But this Pope has been in favor of this. Oh, I'm sorry, man. The other type of married Catholic priests, besides Eastern Europeans, are former Episcopalians. John Paul II allowed Episcopal priests who were married to become Roman Catholic priests and remain married. You couldn't, if your wife died, you couldn't remarry. And if you weren't married already, you couldn't marry. But beginning in the 1980s, we began to see married Roman Catholic priests. Pope Benedict created something called the Anglican Ordinarium, where you have, and this basically is bigger in England than it is in America, where in England, 500 Roman Catholic priests out of approximately 3,000 are former priests of the Church of England, many of whom are married. Now, they are regular Roman Catholic priests, but they've come into it with their wives and family. Now, the rules are, once you can't remarry, and if you're not married, you can't marry. But you could move in to the Catholic Church. Now, why, on a practical level, does the Catholic Church not just have married priests? It's the cost. A Catholic priest makes $25,000 a year at most. He's got a house, he's got he's taken care of, he lives, in a home with other priests. Now, you know that if you want to hire somebody, if you want to hire an assistant for me, somebody who's just graduated from seminary, it's going to cost you $100,000 minimum. Salary, pension, housing. So the cost in Episcopal priest is 4 to 5 times that of a Catholic priest, because it's assuming you're taking care of us and my children, our children. So in places like the Amazon, where there's one diocese where there are like 5 priests for 300,000 people. They can't, nobody wants to go there, nobody wants to be a missionary there, and it's not a very nice, the jungle's not a nice place. They have voted to allow viri probati, married men of proven virtue, viri probati, virtue viri probate proven, to be ordained as Roman Catholic priests. But they're not going to be paid. They'll be non-stipendiary. That's how they're going to make it work. By basically, if you're a carpenter, if you're own the local grocery store or whatever,
Sounds like a volunteer
you can be
position.
you can be ordained as a Roman Catholic priest and be a full priest, just like any other Roman Catholic priest. So these are changes that are going to happen in some form in our lifetime. Yes, Gail?
But with the Roman Catholics, they do provide housekeepers.
That's true. Yes.
They live in
My pastor in Massachusetts
The other day.
was also chaplain at Lowell General Hospital, which was about 20 miles away. So he worked 5 days a week for the hospital, and he got paid by them and Social Security, as well as what he got from the diocese, which was reduced.
Well, that's what I did for a number of years when I was a hospice chaplain. I also worked at parishes like Avon Park and Okeechobee, which are tiny little places that can't afford a full-time priest. So I worked Monday to Friday for the hospice agency, and then on the weekends, I think we got $450 for 2 days, the weekends plus 1 day a week. But that's the sort of thing, Catholic Church, if they had married priests, would have to figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
So in America, it's going to be slower. Yes, Ruth?
The aspect of married versus unmarried and receiving housing allowance and so forth is not that different than the way it was in the military. When I was commissioned in '75, because I had a wife, I got the bachelor quarters, bachelor allowance for quarters, not being a bachelor, that's what it was called, a housing allowance. The men, because we didn't have women officers at that time, that were not married, did not receive any stipend for housing. They lived on the ship. And that didn't change until like the mid-'80s. So, it wasn't that long ago that the entire military was that way also.
Yes, are.
Isn't it kind of a historical precedent that the second or third son, usually of a very wealthy family, became a priest and then became a bishop? So in essence, what I'm saying is that a lot of the priests came from wealthy families to begin with.
Not in America. but in England. There was tradition, and if you read these 19th century novels like Trollope and things like that, there are only 48 dioceses in England, and there are approximately 10 to 15,000 priests. So not everybody becomes a bishop, far from it. And bishops are appointed by the government. They're not elected by the people. So there's usually a political or an interest, there's a poll of some sort. But in England, middle class, it was considered a profession akin to being a doctor or a lawyer where you had a guaranteed income. Because in England, up until the 20th century, the income of a priest was based upon what is called glebe land. Meaning, here's the parish priest, church, and then here's 1,000 acres that the church has owned since the beginning of time that is leased out to local farmers. And the income from that farm pays the salary of the priest. Now, after the Second World War, the Church of England changed all that and sort of almost went to a military type scale, meaning because there were some churches that had huge tracts of lands, and it was a very comfortable living at that parish. And then there were inner city parishes that had nothing, and so the priest basically lived just as badly as his inner city, in the East End of London places. So part of the restructuring, but the practical, where I want to come with this is that so much of what we think at the end of the day is theological really started out as being practical. Why do we have married priests in the Episcopal Church? Well, because that was done for theological reasons, because the Apostle Paul and St. Peter, the disciples, most of them all were married men. We read about Paul's mother-in-law and Peter's mother-in-law. We can sort of assume that if you have a mother-in-law, you got a wife. And so this is why the Catholic Church calls celibacy a gift. It's a gift, not given to everybody. And when we had our Reformation, that was, well, if you have that gift, God bless you. But you don't, that's not going to be a requirement for being a priest. See, the Anglican or the Episcopal way is what they call Reformed Catholic. Now, what's Reformed about it? Is theology that different? A little bit here and there. But what is different are the structures. The major change between the Catholic Church and the Anglican or the Episcopal Church is who's on top, who's in charge. The Episcopal Church, we have in the back of your Book of Common Prayer, something called the Articles of Religion. These were written in the 1500s, and in 1801, the Episcopal Church were just formed out of the Church of England. We had to form a new church because the British prayer book has us pray for the Queen, and that's a problem if you're an American. And so we adopted the Articles of Religion, dropping the bit about the Queen and all this and that, but we have some definitions here in the back. Article 19, the Church. What is the Church? The Church, in the Roman Catholic sense, is the Pope on top, his bishops underneath him, and the lay people underneath that. It's a hierarchy, where all Peter's successor, thou art Peter, upon this rock I build my church. From Peter, everything, Peter's successor, everything flows. The major change outwardly is in Article 19. The visible Church of Christ is a congregation of faithful men in which the pure word of God is preached and the sacraments duly ministered according to the Church's ordinances in all those things that of necessity are required to the same. And in paragraph 2 it says, as the Church of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria have erred, so also the Church of Rome has erred, not only in their living in matter of ceremonies, but in matters of the faith. What is the Church? The Church in the Anglican world is not the bishop. It's not the presiding bishop. This is the Church, the congregation of gathered Christians. And because the ancient churches, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome have made mistakes, the church can make a mistake. Its leaders can screw up. In other words, in our foundational documents, which has shaped our DNA ever since, the church leadership must accept the fact that they need to be teachable, because they're going to make mistakes sometime. And that they, the bishops, are not the church. It's the lay people gathered in community with the priests who are the church. You see that major distinction there? So this is why this Episcopal church can be completely different from an Episcopal church in San Francisco or an Episcopal church in other parts of the country. Just because they do that doesn't mean it affects us, because the center of where we are is we as the gathered community. We have what is called there are three types of church polity, meaning ways of governance. There's the Episcopal or monarchical, meaning there's one guy at the top, that's the Catholic and the Orthodox. Then there's more of the Presbyterian, where each minister sort of runs his own show, but he's in association or fellowship with other ministers, and if he falls afoul of them, he can get kicked out of his ministerial association. Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists are like that. And then there's the independent, where each little church is its own kingdom, and the congregation can hire and fire its minister at will. Baptists. Where does the Episcopal Church fit into that? In all three. Yes, Bob?
Is there ever a time like all the bishops, the Episcopal bishops, would meet like with the Archbishop of Canterbury, like the cardinals do with the Vatican Council?
Yes, they meet every 10 years.
Oh,
That's called the Lambeth Conference. And I've gone to the last three of them. Last three or two? I've been to them since the 90s. So this will be the third one. I'm going next year. The first one I was an aide. The second one I was a reporter. This one I'll be a reporter. They've changed over the course of time. The Lambeth conferences, the bishops would gather and they would discuss things of international global importance. Ordination of women, birth control, things of that nature. After the 98 Lambeth Conference, the Lambeth Conference in 1998 said by an 80-20 margin, homosexuality cannot be countenanced in the church, meaning no gay clergy, no gay marriage. Homosexuals, not just celibate ones, but homosexuals, all people are welcome in the church because we're all sinners, but we cannot change the church's traditional teaching about marriage, about morality, to include homosexuality. The Episcopal Church refused to go along. And there's nothing anybody can do about that. Because the Anglican system is that we Episcopalians don't follow the Archbishop of Canterbury. He is our first among equals. He gives us sort of a steer, but he has no authority. But then, our national church is majority in favor of that issue. Central Florida is not. But just as America doesn't have to follow the Archbishop of Canterbury, Orlando doesn't have to follow New York. And there are parishes in other dioceses that are on the progressive side where you can have a conservative congregation and the bishop is in favor of these liberal issues or progressive issues, and they don't have to do it. Because what is the center of the church? It's the congregation. Now, I said there were three ways of it's just how it's worked out after 500 years. But there are three types, the monarchy, Presbyterian, and the independent. We have aspects of all three. I, as a priest, have a monarch, and he's called the bishop. He can tell me what to do. When he says jump, I say how high.
Which bishop?
Brewer. Presiding bishop means nothing in that sense. Means nothing. Presiding bishop can tell me to do this or do that. And I'll say, oh, isn't that interesting, thank you very much, and I go back and do what I want.
But the presiding bishop can direct the bishop
Yes,
to do things that affect the local parish.
yes, he can, but then it's up to the local bishop to decide whether or not he's going to pay attention.
Isn't it kind of
Or be held, or, excuse me just a second, or be held basically in contempt of the presiding bishop, which is what's occurring in the Diocese of Albany.
Yes, and that's an ongoing issue, because what is contempt, how is it defined, all this and that. But at the end of the day, the only way, see, if this were Baptist polity and you didn't like me, you could have a parish meeting and I'd be out tomorrow. In the Episcopal system, either the sheriff has to hold me off to jail, I die, or the bishop moves me. The congregation cannot get rid of me. They can petition for the bishop to get rid of me, and the bishop will almost always do that, because when it gets that bad, the bishop needs to intervene. But just because I gave 3 stinker sermons in a row, you can't say, okay, you're out of here. So in other words, we have aspects of all 3. And so we're different in the sense that I can honor the Pope. And in other words, I can believe 90% of what he teaches, but I am not required to follow his lead. And I can do that with, anybody, yes.
Isn't it a contradiction in terms, what you're talking about? Episcopal means we think a bishop is in charge. We use a bishop system. But you're saying we do, but we don't.
Yes, it is a contradiction. And here's the thing that people confuse. Does everybody know who John Jay is or was? John Jay was one of the original founding fathers. He was the author, one of the authors of the U.S. Constitution. There's a John Jay College of Justice at NYU or City College. And John Jay was one of our forefathers. John Jay John Jay essentially wrote the Constitution of the Episcopal Church. He did not model it on the U.S. Constitution. He modeled it on the Articles of Confederation. Now, this is getting into American history, which probably 99% of people don't care about or remember. The Article of Confederation said that the state was the sovereign entity, and we formed an association to create the United States of America. This is why why South Carolina could tell Andrew Jackson, we're not collecting any taxes, we're going to nullify these laws made by Washington, because at the end of the day, sovereignty rests in the people of South Carolina, not in the federal government. And it finally took the American Civil War to say that states' rights are subsidiary to the federal Constitution. But the Episcopal Church, because we have the modern American Constitution, our regular Constitution, but the Episcopal Church was based on the prior thing when during the Revolution the states gathered together. That's why we have dioceses that are based on state lines. Because the diocese is considered the sovereign entity that comes together in confederation in the General Convention. The fights of the last 10 to 20 years have been, can the General Convention tell a diocese what to do? I'll give you examples. Women priests began in the 75, 76. Some dioceses, and then the Episcopal Church said, you can have this women priests. Some dioceses, Fort Worth, Texas, San Joaquin in the valley in California, Fresno, Quincy, which is the central part of Illinois, absolutely refused. We will have no women priests whatsoever. Central Florida is one of those dioceses. And the national church could do nothing about it. They could send in groups to say, you really should do this, and the bishop can sit there, and so long as he was polite and didn't say or do anything that could get him in trouble, nobody could do anything about it. What changed in Central Florida was the election of a new bishop, who, when he came in, began to ordain women priests. You could have an election tomorrow of a bishop who will not ordain women priests, And there's nothing anybody can do about it. Unless the bishop does something stupid and saying, I will not ordain women, period. You know, you can't discriminate on basis of sex. But if the bishop finds every woman who comes forward for ordination doesn't meet his standards, guess what? Nothing you can do about it. It's an illogical system, and part of the illogicality is that we have, if you will, the bishops who are sort of kings of their diocese for the clergy. You have the General Convention, which sort of sets the tone, but we never created a judiciary. If there's a fight between two branches, there's nobody to sort out who's right or who's wrong.
What's the purpose of the court of law?
It's no purpose. It doesn't mean to do anything. Its rulings are advisory. So, yes, Gail.
I don't want to get off the track here, but I do have a question about how did the convents in the Episcopal Church evolve?
They evolved in the 19th century, and it came over from England. We had something called the Oxford Movement, where Church of England clergy were looking back at the medieval Catholic Church and saying, you know, not everything they did was wrong. And let's try to recover the best of that tradition. And so some of the stuff they brought back were colored vestments, candles on the altar, things that we just take for granted. Everything was in black and white before that point. I mean, you wore the white cassock, the white surplice, and the black stole over it. That was it.
You talk to the wall.
And you talked. No, you had the altar against the back wall. Well, part of this renewal was women's religious orders, and when it started out, it caused a lot of grief because this was, and remember at that time and that day, women, unless you were married, you didn't really have a life or a purpose. If you were either independently wealthy and you had your money in your own control, or your husband. And so for women who were educated, smart, but didn't feel the call to get married or wanted to be their own person, one of the ways to sort of, if you will, be an independent being is by being a member of a religious order. So these religious orders were founded with specific missions. Now some of them were just to pray, but most of them were founded to be teachers, to run hospitals, to do projects. And so the first women CEOs, chief executives in the United States, were all nuns, running major medical institutions or major social welfare agencies. So for some women, going into if you were of a religious mindset and you did not and wished to basically have a career, and marriage was not one of the things you wished to follow, this was an avenue, and the church said that's fine. Now, today there are two members of our congregation who are nuns. One of them is Sister Ann Rose, who comes to 8 o'clock. She looks like a nun. She wears the traditional habit and everything. Sister Ann Rose was married, her husband died, and in her widowhood, she became more and more attracted to the contemplative way of life, and she joined a convent. But in her particular case, they allow them to live in their homes, but she follows a rule of life based on prayer and service. Mary Guarneri is a nun as well. She's married and has 8 children, 6 children, 8 children.
Together.
Well, that's a bit of a trick, being a Catholic nun with 8 children. And she's still married, she's not a widow. But her order, the Worker Sisters of something or other. What's that again?
It went out the window, the rest of it.
She has a specific vocation. And that's why we have a free counseling center here with a PhD psychologist. That's what she does as her, and she goes twice a year to the convent for a week in some place in the frozen north of Missouri. So women's orders have been part of the Episcopal world for 125, 150 years now. They went through a major decline when women could become priests. but now they're on the comeback again.
They are. Oh.
It's
Did
because,
Barbara Harris have an impact on that?
Excuse
Being
me?
the first female bishop?
Barbara Harris.
Barbara Harris, yes.
the first female bishop was a woman named Barbara Harris. She was an African American. She was a bit controversial. She's an unpleasant person. She has a really foul mouth. I mean, I
She
was,
didn't recruit nuns, obviously.
no, she didn't recruit nuns. She,
I was on standing.
There you go.
She swore like a sailor,
Yeah, right.
I guess.
But what
There's
I'm
nothing wrong with
saying
that, by the way.
is,
I do it all the time.
Once she was ordained, it opened up
Once in a while, I
all
close
kinds
the
of
deep
stuff
end.
for bishops. You got a gay bishop coming in, and you got, I mean, it's like, she kind of opened the floodgates.
yeah, and the theological issue there is a bishop is ordained for the universal church. But what if you ordain somebody who's not acceptable, being a woman or being a non-celibate gay or lesbian person? Because such a person cannot be, in Central Florida, there are no gay clergy that the bishop knows of, because it's considered conduct unbecoming. There are no divorced and remarried clergy. Now, there are clergy whose had marriages annulled, but if I were to run off and leave my wife and marry Mary Kay, God forbid. Now, the bishop would tell me, that's wonderful, George, I'm happy for you, you can pursue your vocation as a taxi driver at this stage. Because you may not be a divorced and remarried priest in Central Florida. That's, everybody knows it. We don't sort of, but there are other dioceses. I have a woman I went to train with who has been married 5 times. And she is in the diocese of, guess what, California.
Is she a widow 4 times?
No. She just, I think Elizabeth's right, she didn't have good choice, she didn't make good choices. Now, I mean, I think what I think about that, but I'm not in a position nor the authority to make that decision. Actually, I'm fine with that myself. But, so, the point that I'm trying to make is, authority is the major difference between the Anglican and the Episcopal world. And it's messy. Yes, Gail?
In the Catholic Church, though, they would hold that against her, where the Episcopal Church, we don't.
No. Gail, you know, you had a first marriage that ended, and then you were remarried. And that's fine, but you had to share it. I mean, but if you did it now, you'd have to go through a lot of hoops and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not like, and the other thing is, they will ask you, were you the guilty party in it?
Never.
No,
According to my ex-husband, yes.
Well, seriously, I have a good friend who's a priest at St. Augustine of Canterbury in Vero Beach. He came down here from New Jersey, and he had been divorced and remarried, and Bishop Howe asked him, tell me about your divorce. Well, his wife ran off with somebody. And he stayed with the kids, and his wife just didn't like him, didn't like her life, didn't like anything, she's gone. And Bishop Howe said, okay, that's fine, because you were not guilty of adultery, fooling around or whatever. I can understand that, excuse that, we'll make an exception for you. Yes, Dominica, you have?
No.
So it's a question of authority, and I have to tell you, it's messy. It's messy, and that's part of the problem we're having all this grief is because the settlement that what we came to at the end of the American Revolution never progressed, and we're trying to squeeze 200 years of constitutional and legal development into 10 to 15 years. So things that we've always done it this way are coming against, well, what are the realities of life? Yes.
How is the Episcopal Church viewed by the Catholic Church?
The Episcopal Church is technically an ecclesial community. They don't call us a church. We're an ecclesial community. But And in 1896, I think, Pius, whichever, 9th or 10th, or 11th, 12, 13, 14, Pope Pius said that Anglican orders are null and void because so that I'm not a real priest, I'm just playing it one. Now, Pius has said that, but John Paul said, well, I'm going to ignore that and allow Episcopal priests to become Catholic priests. You just have to take a few classes, brush up on your Latin, and go through a new ceremony. And now with the Anglican Ordinariate, in essence, it's basically just as hard as me transferring to another diocese for me to transfer to the Catholic Church. So for clergy, there's one standard. For lay people, there's another standard, and for the institution, there's a third standard. Pope Paul, the last Pope Paul, the 6th? Whatever. The one in the 60s. Geoffrey Fisher was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it was the first meeting between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope since the Reformation in the Middle Ages. And he came to Rome, and it was a big deal, and we began these things called the ARCIC, Anglican Roman Catholic International Consultation Talks. Find areas where we're in agreement. When he came, the Pope gave to Geoffrey Fisher the ring, a pectoral or chest cross, and a crozier that they give to the patriarchs or cardinals of the Catholic Church. So basically, in symbolism, the Archbishop of Canterbury is treated like by the Pope as if he were a cardinal. But he can't be told what to do. And we're nice to the Pope to say you're not going to automatically go to hell because you're an Italian Catholic. I'm being silly. But so the official rules and then the practicalities of life. So in parts of the United States, well, here's the other thing I want to talk. Episcopal Church is not a monolith. It's different in different regions of the country. On social issues, on moral issues, on liturgical issues. The Episcopal Church in Virginia, for example, and Stephen Elizabeth could probably speak to this, Bishop Howe came to this diocese from Truro Parish. Bishop Howe would wear a coat and tie to work. Many Virginia clergy do not dress like priests. I think they do nowadays, but in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, up to that point, they were very low church. They wore coat and tie. The thought of Bishop Howe once said to me, the major fight that he had, that he could remember, was when somebody gave the money to buy a processional cross and it was gold plate or gold colored, bronze or whatever. And it upset some people so much because we'd always have a brown wooden one. And now to have a Catholic one was just horrendous.
Yeah, you're right about the
I'm from
other
Philadelphia.
thing.
Our Episcopalianism is very strongly influenced by the other major religion in the beginning of the American era that was found in Philadelphia, the Quakers. I am a Quaker Episcopalian. If you look at my family tree, in and out, in and out. Quakers marrying Episcopalians, marrying Episcopalians, back and forth. And so the mindset of the Philadelphia Episcopal Church is very much internal, spiritualized, let the Spirit lead you. Liturgy is fun, it's nice, but it's not the thing. The inner light, is the thing. Well, how you're led to believe by the Spirit is the thing. That's just that part of the country. The Episcopal Church in New England is very Catholic. Why? Because it's majority Catholic part of the country. So in other words, Episcopalian, and there are parts where they're more like Methodists, they're more like this and that. And the whole thing is called the Episcopal Church. And in Florida, you find everybody here because everybody's from someplace else. And it sort of all comes together. But growing up, as I did in what's called the main line of Philadelphia, which is the train line going from 30th Street Station out to Paoli, every single stop on that train stop had an Episcopal church. And except for St. Somebody's in Rosemont, they were all identical in what they did, how they did it. The priest was Mr. Pickering. If you called him Father Pickering, he'd smack your little face if you were a boy. He was Mr. Pickering. And we had Holy Communion the first Sunday of the month. Rest of the year, the rest of the month, we had morning prayer. And it was very, if you will, cerebral. You know, when you had the exchange of peace, there's some churches, you get a full body hug from the person next to you. Here, it's just, it was in Philadelphia. Hello, how are you? Now, our grandparents knew each other. If they didn't, I'm not going to shake hands with you. You know, just the culture. And what I'm trying to say is that's not neither right nor wrong. It's just the culture in which we are. The culture of this place, nobody's from the canto. There was nothing here 20 years ago but cows. So what do we put the emphasis on? We put the emphasis on being a family for each other because none of us really have family around here. Whereas in our church in Philadelphia, there were 3 or 4 generations. And I sat with my grandparents in the same pew as my parents and my uncles, you know. And you just didn't really move out of that, you know, world. And I went to an Episcopal school called Episcopal Academy. I mean, it was tribal. It wasn't the way it is here. But let me get back to sort of the difference. In the Reformation, the major change was authority and structure. Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon gave him a child, Mary. She couldn't have any more because she had reached the time of life. She was older than Henry by about 8 or 9 years. Before Henry had been married to her, she had been the wife of Henry's older brother, Arthur. Arthur died without any children, and Daddy said, you have to marry the daughter of the King of Spain for these good political reasons. So Henry married his brother's widow. Had the one child, she couldn't have any more. Henry needed a son. He needed a son, and he also was a very lustful fellow anyway. He liked girls. So Henry went to the Cardinal, Archbishop of Canterbury, and said, I want an annulment because my marriage to my dead brother's wife violates these canons, which it did. And so the Cardinal said, sure, Kingy baby, whatever you want, we'll give you an annulment. And all annulments have to go to Rome, be countersigned by the Pope. Problem. King Philip of Spain happened to be campaigning in Italy at the time. And so Catherine wrote to her brother and said, don't let this happen. And so with the Spanish army surrounding Rome, the Pope said, no, I don't think so. And Henry got so mad, he said that, and they passed laws saying the Pope no longer has authority in this realm of England. What changed? Absolutely nothing. The bishops had always been appointed by the king and then been rubber stamped by the Pope. The Pope didn't choose the bishops, the king did. Now the king just no longer bothered sending it to be countersigned. But the service was exactly the same. So Henry got married, who did he marry? Well,
Anne Boleyn.
eventually he married Anne Boleyn, because, well, he married 5 or 6 times, and he had a son, Edward. Edward's family were Protestants, because the Reformation had started. And when Henry died, Edward became king. He was 16 or 17, and his uncle basically ran the show, and England became a Protestant country, fully buying into all this Lutheranism that was happening, Lutheranism and Calvinism. Then Edward died without any children, and Mary, the daughter of his Catherine, became queen, and she was a Catholic. And so the Episcopal Church of England went back to being Catholic. So your wife, you had married your housekeeper, she's now your wife, she's now your housekeeper again.
Crazy.
And you had, in both periods, under Edward and under Mary, you had martyrs, Catholic martyrs and Protestant martyrs. because if you didn't follow the religion of the king, you were a traitor. Then Mary dies, Elizabeth becomes queen, and she splits it down the middle. We are a Reformed Catholic Church. We're not a Protestant church, we're not a Roman Catholic church. We're gonna split the difference. We'll take these things from Protestantism, and we'll take these things from Roman Catholicism, and I'm not gonna ask you any questions. Queen Elizabeth was if you read your little canned history books about the Episcopal Church, she will not seek to place a window into the souls of men. What does that mean? She doesn't care what you believe so long as you do what you're supposed to be doing. So what does that mean? If we have one prayer book, and you follow the prayer book, you can basically believe whatever you want from this. And under Archbishop Cranmer and the subsequent archbishops, we came up with a prayer book that basically split the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. Holy Communion. Catholics believe in the real presence. Looks like bread and wine, tastes like bread and wine, but it truly is, when the priest lays his hand on it, it becomes the body and blood of Jesus Christ. The real presence. We have part of our communion service that you can interpret to mean that. Then we have part of our communion service that says, this is still bread and wine, but spiritually, it's the body and blood of Christ, the Lutheran position. And then you have the extreme Protestant, or Zwingli, after Heinrich Zwingli, the Swiss reformer, that says, this is purely symbolism. Therefore, if there's any bread left over, make a sandwich for lunch after. And so within our communion service, you see you have all three. And so purists will say, God, you people, can't you just settle on one thing? Because of the history and the wars of religion, we decided not to. Now, so some Catholics love to say, oh, well, you're just a church for divorced people. Henry VIII, ha, ha, ha. Ever hear of Napoleon and Josephine? Yes, I told you that.
Yeah, kind of.
Yes.
Did you ever wonder what happened to Josephine?
She was beheaded, right?
Josephine
No, that was another one.
was a beautiful woman, a stunner, a knockout, about 10 years older than Napoleon, and he was like 27 and she was 35, or she didn't really ever give her age clearly, and she already had children, and he married her. She was a widow. Her husband had lost his head during the French Revolution, and he loves Josephine, and boy, life's going on, and then he wants to have an heir. He goes from being a general to first consul to emperor. And an emperor needs an heir. And she's past the point when she can have children. So in 1805, Napoleon asks the Catholic Archbishop of Paris, can I have an annulment? And the reason was that, I don't know what the reason was, but it was basically some clerical thing. That, when we were married, we didn't have 3 witnesses, we only had 2 witnesses. Something along that line. And so the Catholic Church in France gave Napoleon an annulment. And it was sent down to Rome to be countersigned. Well, guess whose army was in Rome? Napoleon's. So Napoleon was allowed to marry the daughter of the King of Austria, Maria, and he had a child. He had a son. And it was only after Napoleon was shipped off to St. Helena that the Pope said, oh, I made a terrible mistake. And he undid the annulment.
Whoa.
And part of it was the King of Austria, who was a good Catholic, wanted his daughter to be sort of free to put her back on the market. And with an annulment, she's free to be put back on the market. So don't give me this crap about Henry VIII, because the Catholic Church has always done that.
They still do.
If you're
If you can't have children, that is the automatic grounds of annulment, no question. No, you have to pay, but.
Keep digging, you'll get it.
Touch on that. So on the issue of marriage, the Episcopal Anglican world is different from the Catholic world. The Catholic world teaches, and officially to this day, once and done. Unless your spouse dies, you cannot remarry within the church. The Episcopal Church, since the 1940s, says you can be divorced and remarried. The rule in this diocese is, if you're at fault, the priest can't marry you. But otherwise, if you've had a divorce, life goes on, you meet somebody new, of course you'll be married in the church, because we forgive and forgiveness and starting over and this and that. But if Prince Charles and Camilla wanted to get married in this church, the answer would be no, because Prince Charles was cheating with Camilla on his wife, Diana, before they were married. So the royal wedding is never going to take place here. And that's why Queen Elizabeth didn't go to Charles's wedding with Diana, and they didn't have it in Westminster to Camilla. He didn't go to the wedding of Camilla. It had to be done at a registry office by a justice of the peace, and then afterwards had a private little blessing service in Windsor Chapel. It wasn't done in the Abbey with the TV cameras and everything, because Charles and Camilla had been fooling around again on his wife. Now, this is so.
Weren't they divorced
in
by
one
that
sense,
point?
it's easier to be Catholic because
they were divorced
it's so
by that
black
point.
and white.
I don't
But the
remember.
Episcopal Church looks at the individual, and each case is a unique case. And I've married many people who've been divorced and remarried, and I always sort of ask them that question. Are you leaving your wife to marry this woman? And because if the answer is yes, then I got to sort of go a little deeper. Or, yeah, I've been married before, it didn't work, but we've been divorced for X years and blah, blah, blah. Great, fine, we'll go forward. Marriage is one area. Another area is baptism. When you're baptized in the Catholic Church, you're baptized as a Catholic. When you're baptized in the Episcopal Church, you're baptized as a Christian. What's the difference? We accept any baptism except for Mormons and Unitarians. Why? Unitarians don't do it in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Mormons, I don't understand Mormonism, but it's not the same thing.
When I was about 15, I went to a Unitarian wedding, and I swear it was the weirdest thing I'd ever heard. It was like the God of the East and the God of the West meet in the middle or something like that. It was very odd.
But my point is, so that the Episcopal Church accepts the baptism of anybody. You become an Episcopalian when you're confirmed. So in other words, you become a Christian at baptism. You notice in our prayer book, the next baptism we'll do, we'll probably have a few later this, hopefully, we'll certainly have some when the Archbishop of Canterbury comes. I know we're going to have some adult baptisms and child baptisms. We don't say the word Episcopal once in the baptismal service. We're Christians. Confirmation is when you basically are sort of nailed down as an Episcopalian. That's why we have the requirement, if you're on the vestry, you really need to be confirmed. Not because you're a better Christian, but because you basically are now Episcopalian, you're a member of the union. The vestry is a closed union shop. Yes, sir.
Okay, help me out here. What are members of this church? Are we parishioners? Is this a parish? Is this a church? Are there members that are not Episcopalian?
Yes.
Okay, so we have confirmed Episcopalians are members, and then we have members who have not been confirmed.
Yes.
Okay.
What is membership?
Okay.
This is a question we're asked all the time. How do I become a member of this church?
Pay your dues.
Come to church and do
Basically,
things.
and I've learned 20 years ago not to give this answer. Well, if you're asking me this question, that means you already are a member. See, we come from the Church of England mindset, where everybody in this parish, which is a geographic unit, if they speak English and they're moving, they're a member of this parish. And how we kept this in the Episcopal mindset is, if you attend this church, if you worship at least twice a year, you support the church, which can mean either financial contributions or you do something, you help somewhere. you are a member of this church. Well, don't I have to believe something, or go through something, or do something, or have an initiation? You can be confirmed if you like. That's the step that allows you to run for office as a vestry member. But you don't have to be confirmed to be a member of this church. Well, if you go to a Baptist church, you have to sign off on all these principles of belief. You have to be baptized. If you're a Catholic church, you have to go through the rite of Christian initiation. RCIA, I think is called. You have to do all these things, and then on Easter Sunday, you join the Catholic Church, the heavens open up, the angels sing. If you're a baptized member of a Christian church and you worship here, you're a member here. Now, we are different from most other churches in that sense, and that membership has a low bar. Show up and be part of the body of Christ.
Hold on, and get your picture taken.
Get your picture taken.
Pledge card.
You don't have to be baptized, you be baptized to receive communion with the faith.
Art, is that right? Art is right. Art said,
Don't sit on that chair like that, you're gonna fall.
Art is right. You don't even have to be baptized to be a member of this church. You have to be baptized to receive Holy Communion. That is why you'll see some infants, the parents choose them not to receive Holy Communion. Bella did not receive Holy Communion until she had a special preparation. Other children, we have Conger, who comes on Saturday night, who's 18 months old. He can finally stand by himself. His parents' desire is for him to receive. The old rules were you had to be confirmed to receive, but that was dropped in the 70s. Yes?
A technical question on the enrollment thing. Catholic couples who have kids get enrollment,
Yes.
where does that leave the kids in the eyes of the church? Are they born out of wedlock?
I don't know. Susan and I, there was a Kennedy wedding in Gladwin, Pennsylvania. And Susan's mother was fascinated by it because this Kennedy, like one of Robert F. Kennedy's children, was marrying him. He had like 6 children already. And he got divorced, he had an annulment and was marrying another time. And Susan's mother and Susan were on a great discussion, well, does that make the children bastards? I don't know the details. Gail says I have to wrap it up.
And my sister is Catholic, and I have a cousin who's a priest who offered to get her an annulment. And she said, no, it's not a religious thing, but technically the children are legitimate, and not necessarily the Catholic Church, but she felt that they would leave. So she wouldn't get the annulment. She got married again in the Episcopalian Church.
And one other thing, we have members who are seasonal, who are Lutherans in Wisconsin and Episcopalians here.
Congregationals, congregationals up there.
Yes, Larry.
Talk about Normans. Who in the Episcopal Church is Normans?
The bishop. You petition the
I
bishop.
never heard of the Normans in the Episcopal